The room at the Four Seasons Hotel was elegant and intimate. Soft lighting. Cream-colored linens. A jazz quartet playing in the corner. The event was a charity gala benefiting the city's youth mentorship program, a cause my husband, David, had been championing for the past 5 years. I remember standing in that ballroom wearing a midnight blue gown that had cost more than my first car, watching my husband at the podium, delivering a passionate speech about the importance of mentorship and trust. Trust. He was talking about trust while his mistress was somewhere in that very hotel, probably waiting for him in a room upstairs. My name is Rebecca Sterling. I'm 37 years old. I come from old money. My family built their fortune in real estate over 3 generations, but I've never been the type to rest on inherited wealth. I studied psychology at Yale and earned my doctorate in clinical therapy. For 15 years, I've worked as a licensed therapist specializing in trauma recovery and marriage counseling. I've helped hundreds of couples rebuild their relationships. I've taught seminars on communication, vulnerability, and emotional intimacy. I've built a reputation as someone who understands the human heart. Ironic, considering I couldn't see what was happening in my own marriage. I stood in the back of that ballroom, clapping politely as David finished his speech about the importance of showing up for people who matter. The irony was so sharp it felt like a knife. He was the keynote speaker at a mentorship gala while systematically lying to me about his whereabouts, his emotions, and his fidelity. He was a master of performance, and I was the audience member who'd been too distracted by my own struggles to see through his act. 6 months earlier, I'd entered therapy myself. Not because my marriage was in trouble, or so I thought. But because I'd been experiencing severe anxiety and depression. The work was intense. Listening to people's trauma all day, helping them heal, absorbing their pain like a sponge. It was taking a toll. I wasn't sleeping. I was having panic attacks. I'd lost 12 pounds I didn't need to lose. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, had recommended that I take several months to focus on my own mental health before continuing to see clients. So I reduced my schedule. I went to therapy twice a week. Wednesday afternoons and Thursday mornings became sacred time. Time to focus on myself, on my anxiety, on my need for control and perfection, on the wound from my childhood where my mother had been emotionally unavailable. David was supportive, or so it seemed. He encouraged me to take the time I needed. He told me he was proud of me for prioritizing my health. He said he'd hold down the fort while I worked through my issues. What he was actually doing was using my therapy schedule as his personal window for infidelity. I didn't piece it together all at once. The discovery was like a slow-motion car crash, each frame revealing new damage, each moment building to inevitable catastrophe. It started with small inconsistencies. David would say he was going to the office on Thursday mornings, but I'd call around noon, and his assistant would say he hadn't come in. When I asked about it later, he'd say he'd handled things remotely, worked from a coffee shop, decided to take a personal morning. Then I noticed charges on our credit card statement. The Riverside Inn. A boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city. 3 times a month. Always on Thursday afternoons or Friday mornings. When I asked David about them, he said it was a surprise. He was planning a romantic getaway for my birthday. He wanted it to be secret. He wanted to surprise me with a weekend away. My birthday wasn't until September. It was March. Something in my therapist's voice came back to me. Something Dr. Okonkwo had said during one of our sessions: "Rebecca, you have an extraordinary capacity to see the best in people. But sometimes that gift makes you blind to the truth. You rationalize behavior that doesn't make sense because you believe the best version of someone. You have to learn to trust your instincts, even when they're uncomfortable." My instincts were screaming. So I did what I should have done immediately: I followed him. The following Thursday, I pretended to have a therapy appointment, but instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot near David's office building. At 9:47 a.m., I watched him exit the building. He wasn't heading toward the Riverside Inn. He was heading toward the parking garage. He got into his car, not the Mercedes he usually drove, but the Audi I'd forgotten we owned, something he rarely took out. I followed him. For 30 minutes, I drove behind him through the city, maintaining distance, my heart racing. He wasn't going to the hotel. He was going somewhere else. Somewhere downtown. Somewhere I recognized. The Park Avenue Apartments. A luxury high-rise in Manhattan, where a studio apartment started at $5,000 a month. David pulled into the underground parking garage. I parked in a visitor spot and waited. 10 minutes later, a woman entered the garage on foot. She was young, maybe 28. Blonde. Elegant. She was wearing a designer handbag and sunglasses despite being indoors. She walked directly to the elevator, swiped a key card, and disappeared upstairs. My husband appeared on the surveillance camera monitor in the lobby, following her moments later. I sat in my car for 3 hours, feeling like I was watching my marriage dissolve in real time. When David finally emerged from the building, alone, it was 1:30 p.m. His hair was mussed. His shirt was partially untucked. His face was flushed. He got back into the Audi and drove back to his office, arriving at 2:47 p.m., just in time to make an afternoon meeting. I drove home and spent the rest of the day feeling numb. I called Dr. Okonkwo and asked for an emergency session. She saw me at 5 p.m. I told her everything: the charges, the hotel, the apartment, the woman. "What do you need right now?" she asked carefully. "I need to know for certain. I need to see it with my own eyes. I need to know if I'm overreacting or if my husband is having an affair. And then what? And then I'm going to decide what to do about it." Over the next 3 weeks, I conducted a systematic investigation into my husband's life. I hired a private investigator and gave him basic parameters: track where David goes on Thursday and Friday mornings, document who he meets with, and find out who lives in apartment 2847 at the Park Avenue building. The report that came back was devastating but not surprising. The woman's name was Natasha Chen. 29 years old. She worked as a personal assistant to a Hollywood producer. She had no significant income of her own, but somehow maintained an expensive lifestyle. The pattern was clear: David was bankrolling her. Over the past 4 months, he had transferred $280,000 to various accounts in her name. For the apartment. For her car. For her clothes and travel. All while I was in therapy, processing my anxiety, believing my marriage was solid. I also discovered something else: David had been using his company credit card to pay for hotel rooms at the Riverside Inn, but not for romantic getaways for me. For hotel rooms where he and Natasha met while I was in therapy. The charges were documented. 12 meetings over 4 months. Each one carefully timed with my schedule. There were also text messages. I'd hired a company to recover deleted messages from David's phone. The conversations between him and Natasha were explicit and emotionally vulnerable. He'd told her things he'd never told me. He'd promised her a future. He'd said he was trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman who cared more about her career than about him. A loveless marriage. I was the woman he was describing as loveless, when I'd spent 15 years studying human connection, helping others heal, sacrificing my own emotional well-being to support his career. The final revelation was the most damaging: David had been consulting with a divorce attorney. Not to reconcile with me or to work on our marriage, but to determine the best way to separate assets and minimize what I'd receive in a divorce settlement. His plan, I realized, was to leave me. He was gathering his ammunition, setting up his escape route, all while I was in therapy trying to heal from my own trauma. And that's when something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Cold, methodical clarity. I'm a therapist. I understand human psychology. I understand how people manipulate, deceive, and justify their behavior. I also understand documentation, evidence, and accountability. And I'm a sterling. My family built an empire by being several steps ahead of the competition. I started building my case like I was preparing evidence for trial. First, I consulted with my own divorce attorney, Patricia Sinclair, and gave her the full picture. I showed her the private investigator's report, the credit card statements, the recovered text messages, the documentation of the funds transferred to Natasha Chen, and the records of David's consultations with his attorney. "This is extraordinarily favorable for you," Patricia said, reviewing the documents. "Your husband has documented everything. His infidelity. His misappropriation of marital funds for an affair. His consultation with an attorney specifically to circumvent your rights in a divorce. This is a textbook case of marital fraud. What does that mean for me financially?" I asked. "It means that in a contested divorce, you have grounds to claim not just 50% of the marital assets, but potentially more based on his fraud. Additionally, any funds he's transferred to his mistress can be recovered, as they were marital property spent on his infidelity. We're talking about potentially recovering that $280,000 plus interest, legal fees, and potentially more." I also hired a forensic accountant to trace all of David's financial movements over the past year. What emerged was a pattern of hiding money. Small transfers to his sister under the guise of loans. Money moved to offshore accounts. Stocks liquidated and transferred to accounts in Natasha's name. My husband had been systematically attempting to hide assets in preparation for a divorce where he'd leave me with as little as possible. But he'd made one critical mistake: he'd left a digital trail. Every transfer, every transaction, every communication. All documented. All recoverable. The second phase of my preparation involved my own psychology background. I recorded all of our conversations over the next month. Not in a secretive way, I informed David that I was concerned about our communication and wanted to record our discussions so we could review them with a therapist. It was a lie, but a calculated one. In my state, recordings are legal if one party to the conversation consents, and I was that party. In those recordings, I led David to reveal more of his deception. I asked gentle questions. "How was work today? Are you feeling stressed? Is there anything you want to tell me?" Each response gave him the opportunity to lie, which he did consistently. Every lie was preserved in digital audio format. I also scheduled sessions with him at a couples therapist, a colleague I trusted who agreed to see us under the condition that I reveal the situation to her beforehand. During those sessions, David continued his charade. He talked about feeling emotionally disconnected from me. He mentioned that he thought I didn't love him anymore because I was so focused on my career. He suggested that we needed to consider whether our marriage was salvageable. The therapist, after our private sessions, agreed to document his statements as evidence of his deceptive behavior during marital counseling. The symbolic moment came when I placed all of my evidence printed, organized, and categorized into a large burgundy envelope. Bank statements, text messages, private investigator reports, recorded conversations, therapy notes, credit card statements showing the transfer of marital funds to Natasha. Everything. I sealed the envelope and placed it in my office safe. That envelope was my insurance policy. That envelope was my power. Then I made my move. I called a family meeting. My parents. My brother. David's parents. Our closest friends. I scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon at my parents' home. I told David it was to discuss our future, that I wanted our family support as we navigated some challenges. He had no idea what was coming. When everyone had assembled in my father's study, I asked David to step outside for a moment. Alone. In private. "What's going on?" he asked, confused. "I know," I said simply. "I know about Natasha. I know about the money. I know about the apartment. I know about the attorney. I know about all of it." His face went pale. Rebecca, I can explain. You don't need to explain to me. But you're going to explain to our families. Because I've spent 15 years helping people heal from betrayal and deception, and I'm not going to be another statistic of a woman blindsided by an unfaithful husband. You're going to tell them the truth, or I'm going to tell them, and I promise you, my version is far more detailed. He stood there, his jaw clenching, his mind visibly calculating escape routes that didn't exist. If you try to minimize this, if you try to make excuses, if you try to shift blame onto me or my career or anything else, I'm releasing everything to your employer, to your family, and to the press. I have recorded conversations. I have financial documentation. I have evidence of your affair, your fraud, and your attempt to hide assets. You have a choice: tell them the truth now, or deal with the consequences of me telling it for you. We went back into the study. David confessed everything. His affair with Natasha. The money. The hidden accounts. The lawyer. The plan to leave me with minimal settlement. Watching his parents' faces shift from confusion to horror to disgust was almost cathartic. His mother started crying. His father's face turned purple with rage. My father stood up and simply walked out of the room. My mother sat in stunned silence. How long? My father asked when he returned, his voice deathly quiet. 4 months, David said. And you were consulting with a lawyer to cheat my daughter out of her settlement. David didn't answer. Patricia Sinclair had advised me that David would cycle through several emotional states during confrontation: anger, manipulation, begging. He did exactly that. First came the anger: I don't owe anyone an explanation. This is between Rebecca and me. Then came the manipulation: Rebecca's been emotionally unavailable. She's chosen her career over our marriage. I was lonely. Finally came the begging: please, I made a mistake. Let's work through this. Let's go to counseling. I'll end things with Natasha. We can fix this. But I was done. I have documentation of everything, I said calmly. I have a forensic accountant who will trace every penny you've hidden. I have recorded conversations where you've lied to me repeatedly. I have your communications with your affair partner. And I have evidence that you were consulting with an attorney to defraud me in a divorce settlement. You're not going to fix this with words, David. You're going to face the consequences of your actions. The legal process was swift and devastating for David. Patricia filed for divorce and immediately moved for a forensic financial examination, citing David's pattern of hidden assets and marital fraud. The court granted the motion. Within weeks, the accountant had traced over $500,000 in hidden or transferred funds. My attorney moved to recover all of these funds, as they'd been spent on David's affair while he was hiding assets for his own benefit. David's employer, a major investment firm, learned about his affair and his misappropriation of company resources when my attorney sent them a courtesy notification about the case. His firm's ethics policy strictly prohibited affairs involving staff or business associates. David was placed on immediate leave pending investigation. Natasha, realizing that David's financial resources would soon be frozen by the courts, abruptly ended their relationship. She moved back to Los Angeles and blocked David on every platform. The affair was over the moment she understood he'd become a liability. The divorce proceedings were contentious, but they were also thoroughly one-sided. Every argument David's lawyer made was countered by documentation. Every attempt to minimize his infidelity was undermined by recorded conversations. Every claim that he deserved a fair share of assets was demolished by evidence of his fraud. 8 months after I first followed David to the Park Avenue apartment, the divorce was finalized. I received 87% of the marital assets, including the house, the investments, the savings accounts, and the recovered hidden funds. David received a modest portion and was ordered to pay spousal support for 5 years. Additionally, he was ordered to pay my legal fees in full, given the extent of his deceptive practices. But the financial settlement was just the beginning of his collapse. His employer, after their investigation concluded, terminated him for violation of ethics policies. With his reputation tarnished in the investment industry, his job prospects evaporated. He was forced to move into a modest apartment and take a position at a much smaller firm at a significant pay cut. Our friends, once they learned the full story, withdrew from him completely. The women in our social circle were particularly unforgiving. They saw him as a cautionary tale. The men felt betrayed by his infidelity and his attempt to hide assets like a coward. Within 6 months, David had become a pariah in our social circle. His parents, devastated by his betrayal of me and his dishonesty toward them, reduced contact significantly. His mother sent him a letter stating that she needed time and space to process his actions. His father didn't speak to him for a year. As for me, I emerged from the process stronger than I'd ever been. I rebuilt my therapy practice with renewed focus. My experience navigating betrayal and deception gave me deeper insight into my clients' trauma. I began specializing in cases of infidelity and marital deception. I wrote a book about psychological manipulation and how to recognize red flags. The book became a bestseller. I was invited to speak at conferences and universities. I became a sought-after expert on infidelity and relationship reconstruction. I also took the opportunity to actually heal. I continued therapy with Dr. Okonkwo, working through not just the betrayal, but my own patterns that had made me vulnerable to it. I learned to trust my instincts. I learned that my tendency to see the best in people needed to be balanced with a healthy skepticism. I learned that love and trust are not the same thing, and that discernment is not cynicism. I traveled. I took a sabbatical from my practice and spent 4 months in Europe, visiting galleries and museums, taking walks through cities I'd never explored. I reconnected with old friends. I attended university reunions. I reclaimed parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of my marriage. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone new. His name was James. He was a colleague I'd known professionally for years, a trauma surgeon who understood the weight of holding other people's pain. We moved slowly. We built trust deliberately. We communicated with radical honesty. 2 years after my divorce from David, James proposed. We married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by people who loved us both. The wedding was everything my first marriage wasn't: authentic, joyful, grounded in genuine connection rather than performance. David, meanwhile, struggled. He dated Natasha briefly after their reunion in Las Vegas, but that relationship ended after 6 weeks when he couldn't provide the financial support she wanted. He had another relationship that ended when the woman discovered his history of infidelity. He attended therapy, eventually recognizing that his behavior had been rooted in his own insecurities and his need for validation. 2 years after our divorce, I received a letter from David. He apologized. Not the manipulative, self-serving apology he'd offered during confrontation, but a genuine acknowledgement of his betrayal and the pain he'd caused. He said he'd been in therapy and was beginning to understand the impact of his actions. He said he wasn't expecting forgiveness, but he wanted me to know that he recognized the severity of what he'd done. I didn't respond immediately. I discussed the letter with Dr. Okonkwo and with James. Eventually, I wrote back. I acknowledged his apology without extending forgiveness. I told him that he could build a better life for himself, but that our relationship would never be repaired. I told him that I hoped he'd learned enough to never repeat those patterns. And I told him that I wished him well, not out of kindness, but out of a belief that everyone deserves the opportunity to become better than their worst moments. But I also told him that trust, once broken, doesn't heal. It doesn't mend. It simply becomes a scar that reminds you of the wound. Here's what I learned through this experience: betrayal isn't just about infidelity. It's about the systematic deception that precedes it. It's about the calculated lies told while your partner is in therapy, trying to heal, trying to be vulnerable, trying to build a stronger marriage. It's about using someone's own investment in growth as a weapon against them. But I also learned that documentation is everything. That calmness in the face of chaos is power. That understanding the psychology of betrayal means you can predict behavior and prepare accordingly. That the best revenge isn't about punishment, it's about ensuring that your betrayer faces the consequences of their actions while you rebuild your life better than it was before. I didn't destroy David's life. He destroyed it himself. I simply made sure that his deception had consequences. I made sure that the truth came out. I made sure that he couldn't hide behind lies anymore. And then I walked away and built something beautiful. That's the real victory. That's the last laugh. If you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've discovered lies and deception in your most intimate relationships, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me how you reclaimed your power. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, betrayal, and triumph. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. These stories of people who've overcome betrayal and built extraordinary lives are coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one.